Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Managerial Accounting. The accounting train keeps barreling down the track regardless of all the cold weather and the snow we've had. We just keep on keeping on. We are all the way up to Chapter 6 now, and we're dealing with what we call a process costing system in Chapter 6. And it's kind of a cousin to the topic we had in Chapter 5, in which we introduced product costing systems and started with a job order costing system. So if you don't remember Chapter 5, or if you're just joining us, there's kind of two things that we hope to accomplish with a costing system. We hope to accumulate all the production costs that we have, and then once we've done that, we hope to assign those costs to the firm's products that are being cranked out. And usually that's done at the unit level. We try to get a per unit cost established. So to kind of look forward to Chapter 6, it might help to kind of look at Chapter 5 and compare and contrast the two systems. So I've got it laid out right here. In Chapter 5, we did job order costing, and the characteristics of that were a unique small batch production. That's mainly the type of manufacturers or service providers that used job order costing. So construction would be an example of that. Anything where we're doing kind of work to a customer specification would be a job order costing environment. So we could also maybe add custom made furniture to that. If we're talking services, maybe a legal firm or an accounting firm doing tax returns and audits. Those would be examples of job order costing. Process costing is mostly used by companies that are doing large-scale homogeneous mass production, where they're making things in big batches that are all the same. So you think of food processing companies, maybe Kellogg's and Rice Krispies, or General Mills and Cheerios, beer, soft drinks, that kind of thing. Chemicals could fall into that category. Basically anything that's made in big batches is going to be better accounted for in a process costing environment. In the job order costing environment in Chapter 5, we accumulated cost by job order. So maybe we had 3 or 4 separate jobs going on at a time. We tracked the cost of those jobs separately. In process costing, we actually accumulate our cost by department. So as a product goes through processing stages, we will track the cost in the departments as they go along and kind of transfer them in and out as that product moves down the line. And to give an example, we'll use the Rice Krispies example. Maybe there'll be a department for milling the flour and turning it into the Rice Krispie, and then maybe there's a department that actually kind of cooks it up, and then maybe there's a packaging department. So the cost would kind of get transferred from one department to the other as they go along. Finally, to get a per unit cost in job order costing, you might remember, we took our total cost and kind of divided that out by the number of units in the job. Process costing is a little bit different. We basically get a per unit cost by averaging the total cost over the units that we produced. So what do you need to know for the chapter? You need to be able to understand something called equivalent units of production, understand what it is and how to calculate it, and we'll look at that in our example. You need to understand the two different ways of kind of conducting process costing, weighted average and FIFO, and we'll get into that too. And then you need to know the 5-step process for doing a product costing problem. So we'll look at that. What we're going to do, I've got a demonstration problem here, and this one's not in your book, so you'll need to make sure you read through everything that I'm showing you, and pause the video if you have to read it and take it in. We're going to be doing Happy Foods, and it's a food processing company that specializes in bottled baby food. What they're going to do in this problem, we're going to calculate the cost of work completed during the month, and then the cost of the ending work in process using weighted average and FIFO methods, and we'll see a separate calculation for both of those. So here's the information. Again, if you need to pause the video, jot this stuff down, go ahead and do that. First slide we have here, we're talking about the units that we have. I have a beginning work in process. You can see some data there. How many units that we started during the month, how many units we completed during the month, and then an ending work in process. Take a second to jot that down. We also have the cost involved with the information that I just gave you. We have beginning work in process. We have direct materials that we've added. We have conversion costs that we added. Conversion costs are generally your direct labor and your overhead. So we come up with a total cost to account for number. So again, pause and write that down. We'll be working this problem using the weighted average method and the FIFO method, and I'll hope to explain the difference between it as we go along. Now, there are 5 steps that you need to know in order to make these problems happen. You need to be able to calculate the physical units that we're trying to account for. You need to be able to calculate the equivalent units. You need to be able to calculate the total cost that we're trying to account for. You need to be able to calculate the total cost per equivalent unit of production, and then once you've got that, assign that to the inventory accounts. So the problem and the way I've got it set up is not in your book. I'm doing a little bit different. I'm doing a way that I think is easier, and I want you to kind of copy this down and follow what I'm doing step by step. You're welcome to do it the way the book has it worked out. I think my way is a little bit easier. If you don't like my way and it's confusing to you, then go back and look at what the book's doing and try it that way. But here's kind of what we've got going on. And again, I want you to kind of pause after I've explained this and kind of jot down what I have here. We're going to do steps 1 and 2 in kind of one blow here. So steps 1 and 2, we're basically trying to figure out how many units to account for and then how many equivalent units that would be. So what I want you to do, along the top, write down production flow, make a column for units to account for, and then equivalent units. And then write down completed units plus ending work in process equals weighted average equivalent units minus beginning WIP equals FIFO equivalent units. So I'll pause and give you a second to get your paper set up. The only thing that you might run into different when you do your problems is sometimes they have conversion costs separated. So you might have to have another column for overhead because direct labor will be in one, overhead will be in the other. So you may have another column there. But this is generally the idea. I've copied the problem information over right here, and all we're going to do is just kind of fill things out. So completed units, we completed 31,000 units during the month, and that information comes from the problem. So the equivalent of that, direct material, would have been 31,000 units completed. And since conversion cost and overhead were done on all those because they're completed, we'd have that same number. We're going to add to that our ending work in process. Ending work in process, 2,000 units were 100% completed for materials, meaning they put them in the materials in at the beginning. So 2,000 to account for. That's 2,000 direct materials that was finished. And then it says 50% for conversion cost. I'm going to take 50% times 2,000 and I get 1,000 units. We add, we have 33,000 units to account for under WA. So our weighted average equivalent units, 33,000 in respects to direct material, and then 32,000 in regards to conversion cost. That's how many equivalent units that we made. And all I mean by equivalent units is basically mathematically converting a partially completed unit into an equivalent whole unit. So we're just kind of making an estimation of how much we could have produced given the resources that we put into it. Okay, so to give you an example, the direct material was put in at the beginning, so it's 100% done. Conversion cost, maybe there's some kind of small little direct labor piece, like maybe you have to screw the lid onto the jar at the very end, and a person has to do that. Or there's a quality control thing at the end that someone has to do. So it's not quite completely done. So we try to convert that not quite completely done into an equivalent unit of being completely done. Makes the accounting a little bit easier. So our beginning work in process, we're going to pull 5,000 units and back that out. It says 100% completed for material, so I'm going to put 5,000 under direct material. It's only 40% completed for conversion cost, so I'm going to put 2,000 in there. 5,000 times 40% done is 2,000. So we'll subtract our weighted average equivalent units minus the beginning work in process, and that gives us a FIFO equivalent unit. And we just go across, and we'll do that. So that's step 1 and 2. If you set it up exactly like I have it set up, you'll be a lot better off. Now let's look at the final steps here, and we'll start with weighted average. Here we have steps 3 to 5, and just to kind of refresh your memory as to what those were, step 3 was calculate the total cost to account for. Step 4 is calculate the cost per equivalent unit, And then step 5 was assign cost to inventory account. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So back to our problem. And again, I want you to set this up on your paper in a spreadsheet, however you want to do it. Give me 4 columns across the top. Label total cost, direct material, and conversion cost. Then going down your rows, give me one for beginning WIP plus current cost equal our total cost to account for. Then we're going to divide that by the equivalent units weighted average, and we calculated that in step 1 and 2. We'll get a unit cost per unit for the weighted average, and then we'll kind of do this bottom part here. Units completed, ending work in process, direct material, conversion cost, and we'll get a total work in process and a total cost accounted for. So that's kind of the part where we assign the cost to the inventory accounts. I've got the data right here from the problem, so we'll go ahead and start filling it out. Beginning work in process, our total beginning WIP was 9,360. Direct material, 8,060. And conversion costs were 1,300. Again, conversion costs being your direct labor and your overhead. Our current costs that we incurred are also listed on there. We had direct materials of 41,440. We had conversion cost of 14,700, and that's going to give us a total of 56,140. So we add those up. Total cost to account for 65,500. You can see that number right there in the problem. Total direct material 49,500. Conversion cost 16,000. We're going to spread the cost of our direct material and conversion cost across our equivalent units. So going back to the problem before, weighted average equivalent units were 33,000 for direct material, 32 for conversion cost. So I'm going to divide by 33,000. I'm going to divide by 32,000. I get a unit cost weighted average for direct material of $1.50 per unit and 50 cents per unit for conversion cost, for a total of $2. Okay? So that's step 3 and step 4. Step 5 says apply that per unit cost to our ending inventory. So we completed 31,000 units according to the problem. So I'm going to take that $2 per unit total cost and multiply it by 31,000, and I get 62,000. My direct materials, we had 2,000 equivalent units in ending WIP. So I'm going to take 2,000 and multiply it by $1.50, which I get from right there, the unit cost for direct material. And I come up with 3,000. For the conversion cost, if we look back, we had 1,000 in our ending WIP. So I'm going to take that 1,000 times 50 cents, and I come up with 500. I get a total work in process of 3,500. So when I say apply the per unit cost to our ending inventory, well, there's our finished goods inventory right there. We've applied 62,000 of that 65,500 we had to account for to our finished goods. 3,500 we've applied to total work in process. Okay, so the total cost we've accounted for, 62,000 plus 3,500, is 65,500. Notice that that equals the total cost that we were trying to account for. So that's kind of the idea. We had 65,500 of cost to account for, and this is how we accounted for it. Okay? That's the weighted average. What we're trying to do in weighted average is we're getting an average of every unit completed during the month, regardless of when it started. Okay? It could have started in the month before, it could have started 2 months before. All we know is it's just in beginning WIP. Okay? So we're trying to get an average of every unit that we've completed during the period, regardless of when we began that work. Okay? Let's move on to FIFO. The difference in FIFO is that we're really going to ignore any prior period cost. Okay? We just want to get the average cost of the units that we started and completed in the period that we're looking at. We don't care about what happened in the beginning work in process. So we're kind of ignoring that. So here's our data. We're going to set it up a little bit differently. You'll notice this part here looks pretty much the same. So go ahead and set it up like you did the weighted average. Total cost, direct material conversion along the top. Then your beginning WIP plus current cost equal total cost to account for divided by the equivalent units equals unit cost FIFO. You'll set that up exactly like we did in the problem before. When we apply the unit cost to inventory, notice it's a little bit different because we have ending WIP on the top and then we have units completed down here at the bottom. Okay, so pause for a second, set it up, and then we'll plug our numbers in. Are we all set? Okay. Total cost, beginning WIP, we're at 9,360. Now again, the difference in FIFO, we're going to put a 0 for direct material and conversion cost. In FIFO, we ignore the beginning WIP. We're only concerned with things that were started and completed in the current month. So current month cost, just like before, 41,440, 14,700, gives me a total of 56,140. Total costs to account for are still the same, 65,500, and we just carry down our direct material and conversion cost. We will divide that by our equivalent FIFO units. So we look back, equivalent FIFO, 28,000 for direct material, 30,000 for conversion cost. So we'll divide by 28,000, and we'll divide by 30,000 for conversion cost. And I get $1.48 per unit for direct material and 49 cents per unit for conversion cost, for a total of $1.97 per unit. Okay. Ending work in process for direct materials. We'll look back. We had 2,000 and 1,000 once again. 2,000 and 1,000. So 2,000 times $1.48 gives me 2,960. 1,000 times 49 cents gives me 490. My total WIP, 3,450. Now that we've got the total WIP calculated, we come to the reason why we put units completed on the bottom instead of at the top. We know we need to account for 65,500. We've accounted for 3,450 of it. So to get our units completed, all we're going to do is take the amount we had to account for, 65,500, and again that number comes from right there, and we're going to subtract what we've already accounted for, 3,450. The difference has to be units completed, or 62,050. So we take 3,450, 62,050, and we get our 65,500. That's how we do the LIFO portion of it. Okay, so we weighted average, we got FIFO, and if you're looking at those, you might be wondering, okay, well, how do we know when to use one or the other? Well, the general rule of thumb, if we're talking about a company that has a pretty steady production pattern, they're producing relatively similar amounts every single month, they're probably going to use a weighted average method. If we're talking about a company that's very seasonal, they produce maybe a lot during the winter months but not a lot during the summer months, then we'd be looking at a FIFO. So weighted average is if we have similar production amounts every month, and then FIFO is more if we have fluctuating amounts every month. That's the idea. Again, I've demonstrated it a little bit differently than what you're going to see in the book. The book has you writing out a whole lot of different things and kind of chasing numbers around all over the place. I think if you lay it out like this, it's a lot easier to get everything put in there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to help you. You can contact me. But if you lay it out like I've showed you, I think you'll be okay. If not, I'd be happy to help. So if you need anything, just let me know.